"You're fired. Right now." Gerald Boyd tossed her employee badge onto the counter in front of Della Hartman, because $7 had just vanished from the register, and he needed a name to close the books before the audit team walked through the door on Monday morning. The camera on the ceiling had clearly captured that she never once touched the cash drawer that night. He didn't bother to replay the footage. A widowed waitress, raising a small child alone and caring for an ailing mother in the hospital, who had worked at the Ardent Room for 5 years without a single person to stand behind her. That was the cheapest name he could write down. Della didn't argue. She untied her apron, folded it into quarters, and set it neatly on the counter. Her hands did not tremble. Before she turned to leave, she asked only one quiet question: whether he was certain $7 was worth what he was trading away. Gerald laughed. But the laughter died halfway out, as the man who had been sitting silently at the corner table all evening slowly set down his glass and rose to his feet. The whole dining room fell into a different kind of silence, because a few of the longtime servers had just recognized that face, the name that even Gerald Boyd would never dare say aloud. But $7 was not the most dangerous thing that left the restaurant that night. Della was the only one who had ever noticed that number quietly appearing where it should never have been, and she had been silently keeping the evidence for months, in a stack of papers no one ever imagined a poor waitress would bother to save. Stay until the end, to see how $7 brought down an entire empire built on silence. If Della's story touched your heart, leave a like and share it so it can reach more people. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story worth staying for. The last streetcar of the day dropped Della 3 blocks from her apartment building, and she walked the rest of the way through the early season chill of Chicago, both hands gripping the collar of her thin coat. She didn't cry. All along the way, she only kept turning the numbers over and over in her mind, numbers that had now changed their meaning completely. The rent due at the end of the week, the electric bill already overdue once, and the hospital charges that grew thicker every week like a ledger with no final page. 5 years of waiting tables at the Ardent Room hadn't given her any comfort or abundance, but it had given her one certain thing: a steady paycheck she could build her calculations around. Tonight, even that certainty had been wiped away by a man with one sentence and a card tossed onto the counter. She stopped in front of the door to her 3rd-floor apartment, drew in a deep breath, then shaped the corners of her mouth back into a smile before sliding the key into the lock. Inside, the smell of hastily cooked pasta still lingered in the tiny kitchen, and a bright, high voice rushed toward her almost at the same moment the door opened. Maisie, 8 years old, ran across the worn rug with a sheet of drawing paper held high above her head like a flag. The little girl cried out that she had finished it since the afternoon, and that her mother had to look at it right away, without waiting even 1 second. Della knelt down until she was level with her child, and every burden she had carried home from the restaurant seemed to be folded up and hidden somewhere deep inside her chest, leaving only warmth on her face as she looked at the picture. On the paper was the figure of a woman wearing an apron, carrying a tray in one hand, and wearing something on her head that Maisie explained with great pride was a crown. The little girl pointed to the crooked line of words underneath and spelled each word aloud. "My mom is my hero." Maisie said that in class, her teacher had asked every child to draw their hero, and the other kids had drawn firefighters and astronauts, but she had drawn her mother, because her mother worked all day and still came home every night smiling at her. Della felt her throat tighten, but she kept her voice calm, praised the picture, praised the crown, and asked her why the hero was carrying a tray. Maisie answered matter-of-factly that heroes had to work, of course, then giggled at her own reply. Della taped the drawing to the refrigerator door, right beside the older pictures with curled edges, then urged the little girl to go brush her teeth. The whole apartment was only as large as one corner of the dining room at the restaurant where she had just been fired. But under the warm yellow light, it was the entire world Della was struggling to keep from breaking apart. Once Maisie was tucked beneath the blanket, she asked her mother to keep reading the story about the little fox who had lost its way, the story they had left unfinished yesterday. Della sat down on the edge of the bed, opened the thin book, and read in the low, gentle voice that only her daughter ever got to hear. She read slowly, changing her voice for each character, until Maisie's breathing began to even out, and her eyelids drooped halfway through a sentence. Only then, sitting in the darkness of the small room with the steady sound of her daughter's breathing beside her, did Della allow her face to fall. She took out her phone and opened the last message from the hospital again, the line of text reminding her that the advance payment for her mother's next round of treatment had to be paid within 10 days. Her mother had been lying there for nearly 2 months, And every time Della came to visit, the older woman still tried to hold her daughter's hand, still asked whether her granddaughter was being good, as though she herself were the one who needed to comfort her daughter. That was why Della had gritted her teeth and stayed at that restaurant for so long, enduring the endless shifts, Gerald's hollow words, all of it only because the paycheck at the end of the month was the one thread tying this apartment to that hospital bed. Now that thread had snapped. She placed the phone face down on her lap, looked out the window where the city lights spilled in broken patches across the room, and for the first time all evening, she let herself truly feel the weight of everything $7 had taken from her. The man sitting at the shadowed corner table of the Ardent room that night hadn't come there to dine. Cassius Wolfe had been sitting there for nearly 2 hours with a glass of wine he had barely touched, his eyes not on the menu, but on the way the bills were printed, carried away, then returned to the cashier's counter, because this restaurant was one of the links in the chain of assets he controlled through many layers of different names. And over the past 3 months, something in its books had left him uneasy. The numbers at the Ardent room were consistently a little higher than the actual flow of customers could explain. A small difference each day. So small that no one would pay attention to it, but when gathered over many weeks, it became a smooth stream of money flowing toward a place he still hadn't been able to trace. Cassius wasn't a man easily fooled inside anything that belonged to him, and he had come here tonight to observe in silence, without warning, without attendance, just one quiet man among the crowd of diners, waiting to see which link inside this restaurant was lying to him. He hadn't expected that what struck his eye would not be a number on paper, but a human being. When Gerald Boyd threw the employee card onto the counter and fired the waitress over $7, Cassius recognized the absurdity of it at once, because no honest manager would be so quick to close the book on a shortage that small before an inspection, unless he was trying to hide something much larger underneath. And then he heard that woman, instead of begging or crying, ask only in a soft voice whether $7 was worth the exchange, a question so composed that it made him set down his glass and rise to his feet, because it had been a very long time since he had seen someone driven to the edge, and still not lose her dignity. In the moment she folded her apron and placed it on the counter, Cassius saw again something he had buried a very long time ago. He remembered his mother, the woman who had spent nearly her whole life cleaning houses for wealthy families in this city, the woman who, one winter afternoon when he was 13 years old, had been accused by her mistress of stealing a brooch, then thrown out the door without anyone bothering to listen to half a word she had to say, even though she was innocent. He remembered how his mother had gone everywhere asking for work, with that stain of disgrace clinging to her like an ink blot that couldn't be washed away. He remembered the meals growing smaller day by day, remembered the way she still kept her back straight when she stepped into the homes where people hired her, until her health collapsed under poverty, and she died without ever being given a single apology. That death had taught Cassius one thing that later became the core of who he was. That in this world, the strong always believed the weak were incapable of striking back, and that arrogant belief was their greatest opening. He had spent all his youth climbing into the very world that had once crushed his mother, and when he finally stood in a place where no one dared speak his name too loudly, he set one rule for himself, the only rule he had never broken, that he could be cruel to anyone, but never to someone who had been pushed all the way to the bottom and was still trying to stand upright. So when the restaurant door closed behind Della Hartman that night, Cassius was no longer thinking about $7. He was thinking about how that manager had chosen the wrong person to blame, and how, for the first time after many months of searching, the money trail he had been hunting had accidentally revealed to him a thread to follow, pulled loose by the very woman who had just been thrown out through that door. He sat there a while longer, committing Gerald Boyd's face to memory, then quietly left before anyone had time to understand who the silent guest at the shadowed corner table really was. When Maisie's breathing had sunk completely into sleep, Della slipped away from the edge of the bed, as quietly as she could, went out to the living room, and reached up to the top of the cabinet, where she kept an old tin box behind a stack of folded towels. She brought it down to the table, sat beneath the faint pool of light from the desk lamp, and opened the lid. Inside was a stack of papers she had smoothed flat and arranged in chronological order, duplicate copies of bills that for many months she had quietly kept instead of tossing into the trash as usual. And now, under the late-night light, she turned through them one by one, tracing back over something she had long felt was wrong, but had never been able to name clearly. She had first begun noticing it on a summer evening, when an elderly customer sitting at one of her tables frowned at the bill and asked what the $7 optional service fee at the bottom was, because he hadn't ordered anything extra by that name. Della hadn't known either at the time. She only apologized, carried the bill inside, and quietly removed the charge for the man, but his question stayed with her. From that evening on, every time she printed a bill for a customer, she began looking more closely, and she realized that the $7 line, called an optional service fee, didn't appear on every bill. It slipped only into the bills of certain people, usually older customers paying in cash, solitary guests dining alone, people who hurriedly signed their checks without studying every line, or out-of-town visitors who stopped in once and would never come back to ask questions. Della was the one who carried those bills directly to the tables, so she was the only person in a position to see that quiet pattern. And the more she looked, the less it resembled a random machine error, because a printer that made mistakes would make them blindly. But this was selective. This was clever. This knew exactly how to avoid the people who might speak up. She had brought this to Gerald Boyd 2 times. The first time, she placed a bill on his desk and asked whether that fee was part of a new policy she hadn't been told about. And Gerald only glanced at it, told her it was a system charge, an accounting matter, not the business of a waitress, then pushed the paper back toward her as though he were brushing away a fly. The second time, when she pressed more firmly and said that a customer had complained, he lifted his eyes to her with a cold stare and reminded her that there were plenty of people out there willing to take her job if she found it too full of questions. A sentence that made her understand silence was the price of keeping the paycheck that fed her mother and her child. So she had stayed silent, but she hadn't forgotten. And she did the only thing someone in her position could do. She began keeping those bills, one duplicate copy at a time, tucking them into this tin box, not because she knew what she would do with them, but because some instinct told her that one day, someone would need to see them. Now, beneath the late-night lamp, she turned to the final sheet and looked at the stack of papers growing thick in her hands. And for the first time she allowed that thought to take clear shape, that if the bills that had passed through her hands alone were already this many, then she didn't dare imagine how large the real number would be once the other tables, the other shifts, and the months before she had noticed were all counted too. She didn't yet understand the full scale of what she was holding. She only knew one thing for certain, that it was wrong at the root, and that the $7 that had cost her job tonight wasn't a coincidence, but a loose thread sticking out from a much larger piece of cloth. That night, after the restaurant had closed and the last of the servers had gone home, Gerald Boyd was still sitting in the cramped office behind the kitchen, his hands laced together on the desk, and he didn't feel the slightest relief, even though he had managed to push Della Hartman's name onto the report. On the contrary, the more he thought about it, the colder his spine became, because firing her hadn't been meant to punish a thief. It had been a hurried move to plug a hole he hadn't created himself, yet was sitting directly on top of. The $7 shortage in the cash drawer at the end of the day hadn't been stolen by anyone, and Gerald knew that better than anyone else. It was a small crack leaking out of the very surcharge system, running quietly beneath the restaurant's books. The hidden mechanism that added tiny amounts of money to customers' bills, then gathered them into a handsome stream of revenue. And sometimes, during the final reconciliation of the day, the numbers didn't line up as smoothly as they were supposed to. Normally, no one would pay attention to a difference that small, but this time was different. This time, an inspection team would walk through the door on Monday morning, and if they saw that mismatched number and grew curious enough to trace it back to its source, the whole surcharge mechanism would be dragged into the light. So Gerald had done what he believed was the cleverest thing in his panic. He turned a flaw in the system into a human mistake, writing in the log that the cause of the shortage had been identified and the employee involved had been dismissed. A neat little line for the inspectors to read, node over, and then turn the page without bothering to dig any deeper. He had just lit his second cigarette when his phone vibrated, and the name on the screen made his finger freeze before he pressed answer. On the other end of the line was Lionel Frost, and that voice wasn't loud, wasn't rushed, but so coldly calm that it was more frightening than shouting. Lionel asked whether he had finished handling that little matter at the Ardent Room, and when Gerald answered that the books had been closed cleanly, that someone had taken the blame, Lionel only let fall a reminder that this matter had better stop right there, that the inspection team must not be allowed to see anything deeper than a minor employee error. Gerald heard the line in that voice, the line he absolutely must not cross, and he understood very clearly that if everything came apart, the first person pushed forward as the sacrifice wouldn't be the man sitting in some distant regional office. It would be him, the manager whose name was signed on every paper in this restaurant. That very thought was what had driven Gerald, many months earlier, to begin doing something he had never told anyone about. Every time Lionel called or sent a message to give instructions, to explain how to cover the numbers, to remind him to adjust this or blur that, Gerald quietly saved it, copied every line of text, recorded every appointment, and hid them in a place Lionel would never expect. He hadn't done it out of courage or conscience, but because he was cunning enough to understand that in a relationship built on lies, the only thing that could save your life when the boat sank was a life raft the other man didn't know you were holding. When the call ended, Gerald sat motionless for a very long time in the smoke of his cigarette, telling himself over and over that he had closed the books properly, yet unable to shake the vague unease that the woman he had thrown out the door tonight might not have left as empty-handed as he believed. 2 days later, just as Della stepped out of the coffee shop where she had submitted an application for a dishwashing job on the night shift, a dark-colored car pulled up to the curb directly in front of her, and the man who stepped out from the back seat was the quiet customer from the shadowed corner table on the night she had been fired. Della stopped short, and her first reaction was not fear or curiosity, but a quiet wariness. She took half a step back, tightened her grip on the strap of her bag, and looked straight at him without lowering her eyes, even though she had already realized, from the way her former co-workers had whispered, that this was not an ordinary man. Cassius recognized that at once, and that was exactly what drew his attention, because he was far too used to watching people change color when they knew who he was. Some became eager and flattering, some turned pale and looked away. But the woman standing before him did neither. She simply stood there, kept her distance, and waited for him to say what he wanted. He introduced himself as Cassius Wolfe, without adding any title or boastful word, then said plainly that he had been at the restaurant that night and had heard the question she asked the manager before she walked out the door. Della studied him in silence for a moment, then asked what a man like him could possibly care about a waitress being fired over $7, and Cassius replied that he didn't care about $7. He cared about the fact that someone pushed to the edge could still ask a question that clear-headed, because in his experience, people who could keep a cool mind while being trampled were often people who had seen more than they were saying. She didn't rush to trust him, and she said so directly. She told him she had no reason to tell her story to a stranger who had just stepped out of an expensive car, that kindness from people in his world usually came with a price that people like her couldn't afford to pay. Cassius didn't argue. He only nodded, acknowledging that her suspicion was reasonable, and then he did something that surprised her. He didn't make promises, didn't tempt her, and only said that he believed the $7 charge wasn't an isolated number, and that if she had ever noticed it appearing where it shouldn't have been, then perhaps she and he were looking at the same thing from two different sides. That sentence touched the very thing Della had been losing sleep over for several nights, and after a moment of hesitation, she decided to offer a small test instead of her full trust. She opened her bag, took out 3 bills she happened to be carrying, and held them out to him. Not the whole stack hidden in the tin box. Only 3 sheets, just enough to see how he would react. Cassius took them, and when his eyes passed over the line that read $7 optional service fee printed at the bottom of each one, his whole face changed in a way so slight that only someone as observant as Della would have noticed, because in that instant he had fit together the missing piece he had been searching for through many months. The trickling stream of money he had chased without finding its source had now taken shape on the 3 pieces of paper in his hand, and they had been given to him by the very woman who had just been pushed out through the door of the place where it was born. He looked up at her, and this time there was a different kind of seriousness in his eyes. He told her that those papers were more dangerous than she realized, that she had accidentally kept in her hands something many people would do anything to make sure no one ever saw, and that from this moment on, whether she chose to trust him or not, she needed to understand that she was no longer truly safe. Della looked at him for a long time, and she didn't answer right away, but she didn't walk away either, and both of them understood that her silence itself was the beginning of something. The next morning, before the restaurant opened, Gerald Boyd called Owen Brady into the back office and closed the door, and the young server, only 23 years old, immediately sensed that something was wrong from the way the manager tried to force a friendly smile, the kind he had never once given him before. Gerald invited him to sit, said a few vague things about how Owen was an employee with a future, how he had been keeping an eye on him for a long time, and was considering promoting him to shift lead next season. And just as Owen still hadn't had time to understand why he was suddenly being praised so highly, Gerald pushed a typed sheet of paper across the desk toward him. Owen lowered his head to read, and with every line his eyes moved across, his heart sank another beat, because the paper was a written statement saying that he had personally seen Della Hartman approach the cash drawer during the period when the shortage happened that night, wording carefully arranged to turn her ordinary presence near the counter area into a deliberate act. Owen looked up and said it wasn't true, that he had never seen Miss Della do anything like that he had been working tables in a completely different section that evening, and that she had never gone near the cash drawer, and his voice trembled a little because he wasn't used to arguing with someone above him. Gerald didn't show anger. He simply leaned back in his chair, watched Owen with a calm, calculating look, then gently reminded him that this was only a procedure to complete the file before the inspectors arrived, that the matter was already over, and Della was already gone, and that his signature wouldn't change anything except help everything close neatly. When Owen still hesitated, Gerald shifted his tone so slightly, but sharply enough for the young man to understand. He said Owen was young, that he still had a whole road ahead of him, that he was supporting his mother and still paying off his college loans, and that in this difficult economy, someone whose file carried a reputation for not knowing how to cooperate with management would have a very hard time finding another place willing to hire him. The sentence wasn't an open threat, but it hung suspended in the small room, like a noose lowered right above Owen's head, and he understood very clearly what Gerald didn't say outright, that if he didn't sign, the next person pushed out through this door would be him. Owen sat there with the pen in his hand, and through a few long, endless seconds, he saw in his mind Della's kind face, the older coworker who had once traded shifts with him on the day his mother was hospitalized, who had quietly saved him an employee meal on the nights he worked late and didn't have time to eat anything, who had never spoken a harsh word to him in the 2 years he had worked here. He knew very well that putting his pen to this paper meant betraying all of that, meant adding one more brick to the wall people were building to bury an innocent woman, and that knowledge left his palm soaked with sweat. But then he thought of his mother lying at home waiting for medicine money, thought of the bills piled on the kitchen table, thought of the bare fear of a young man who had nothing in his hands except this unstable job, and in the end, that fear won. Owen signed, his handwriting crooked and misshapen, nothing like his usual signature, then pushed the paper back to Gerald without daring to look him in the eyes. When he stepped out of the office, the morning sunlight pouring through the restaurant windows suddenly became painfully harsh, and he realized that the weight pressing on his chest now would not fade with the day, that he had just traded the peace of his conscience for a place to stand that he was no longer sure he wanted to keep. Lionel Frost wasn't the kind of man who let a smoldering threat grow on its own, and when Gerald reported back that the waitress who had been fired didn't seem willing to disappear quietly as expected, he immediately decided to strike first, before Della had time to become a real problem. Within only a few days, a story began to spread through the narrow little world of restaurants and diners around the area. A story released with care through several phone calls and a few suggestive remarks placed exactly where they needed to be, saying that a waitress had just been dismissed from a fine dining restaurant for being involved in some shady money matter, that she had been caught cheating, and that they had quietly let her go to avoid scandal. That rumor didn't need evidence. It only needed to be repeated often enough by enough mouths, and before long, Della felt its consequences directly and brutally, because the coffee shop that had once promised to call her back about a night shift dishwashing job suddenly informed her that they had hired someone else, and the 2 other places where she had applied didn't even bother to return her calls. She called a manager who had once shown some sympathy toward her, and after a strained, awkward pause, the person lowered their voice and advised her that it would be better if she looked for work in another neighborhood. Because here, her name was now tied to a kind of bad reputation no one wanted to touch, even though that person admitted no one truly knew what had or hadn't happened. Della put down the phone and stood motionless in the middle of her small kitchen, feeling for the first time the cruelty of a weapon she had no real way to defend herself against, because she could argue with a specific accusation, but she couldn't argue with a shapeless whisper, a shadow that had been released and was quietly choking every doorway before she even had a chance to knock. But the thing that truly chilled her came that evening, when her phone lit up with a message from an unknown number with no name attached. The message was written in a tone so polite it was horrifying. It said the sender only wanted to remind her of the things that truly mattered in her life. That a mother, raising a young child alone while carrying a growing hospital debt, should be careful to keep her record clean, because agencies responsible for children were always very concerned about whether a child was being raised in a stable and healthy environment, and that it would be such a shame if someone sent them information that made them question her ability to care for her daughter. By the time Della read that far, the hand holding her phone had begun to tremble, not from anger, but from a primal, freezing fear rising from the deepest place in a mother's heart, because whoever stood behind this message had been cruelly intelligent enough not to aim at her money or her honor anymore, but straight at the one weak point that could make her collapse completely, the little girl sleeping soundly in the room on the other side of the wall. She hurried to the crack of her daughter's door, eased it open, and looked inside to see Maisie still sleeping peacefully, one arm wrapped around her old stuffed bear, her small innocent face knowing nothing of the storm closing in around her mother outside that door. And it was precisely that carefree peace on her child's face that made Della's chest tighten even more, because she understood that she would have to carry the full weight of this alone, and absolutely not allow even a trace of its darkness to touch the clear little world her daughter lived in. She stepped back, softly closed the door to her child's room, then sank down onto the chair in the corner of the dark kitchen, covered her face with both hands, and in that moment she felt as though she had been driven into a corner with no way out, stripped of her job, stripped of her good name, close to losing even the ability to support her child, and threatened with the most precious thing in her life. But amid the fear rising over her head, something else also began to kindle inside her, low burning and hard, the anger of a mother forced against the wall, the feeling that if they had dared to touch her child, then she no longer had anything left to be afraid of losing. The call from the hospital came early the next morning, just after Della had gotten Maisie fed and sent her over to the kind neighbor's apartment so she could go to school, and the calm voice of the nurse on the other end told her that her mother's condition had worsened overnight, that the doctors said she needed to be moved to a more intensive course of treatment as soon as possible, and that the cost of this new round of treatment would have to be arranged within the short time ahead. Della stood still in the kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear, and she felt as though the ground beneath her feet had tilted slightly, because the timing of this terrible news couldn't have been more cruel. It had come just as she had lost her job, just as she had been smeared so badly that no place would take her, just as her own child had been threatened, and now the last thread keeping her mother in treatment was fraying right before her eyes while she stood helpless. Unable to hold it together, she hung up, stood motionless for a long while, then quickly wiped her face, put on her coat, and caught the bus to the hospital, because even though there was almost nothing left in her pocket, the only thing she knew she had to do was go to her mother's side. When she stepped into the familiar hospital room, her mother was lying propped against the pillows, her face pale and much thinner than it had been the summer before, but her eyes still lit up when she saw her daughter, and she reached out her hand the way she always did whenever Della came. Della pulled a chair close to the edge of the bed, took her mother's thin, cold hand between both of hers, trying to warm it, and she fought to keep a very gentle smile at the corners of her mouth so her mother wouldn't read the storm raging inside her. Her mother asked whether her granddaughter was well, whether she still liked drawing pictures, and Della told her about Maisie's newest drawing, about the crown and the words saying hero, and for the first time in many days, a soft, real laugh escaped the old woman's lips, a fragile sound, but one that was enough to ease a little of the heaviness in her daughter's heart. Her mother gave her hand a faint squeeze, and in a voice that had grown much weaker, she said she knew Della had been struggling lately, that a mother could always feel such things, no matter how well her child tried to hide them, and she told Della not to let the burden of her illness drag her daughter's life down, not to trade away her own future and her granddaughter's future for someone like her, someone who had already lived nearly a whole lifetime. Della shook her head, and she spoke to her mother in a firm voice, even though she was breaking apart inside, telling her never to think that way again, that her mother was the one who had taught her what it meant not to abandon the people she loved, no matter how hard things became, and that she would find a way. She always found a way. Her mother only needed to rest and get stronger. The older woman looked at her daughter for a long time, with eyes soaked in a whole lifetime of hardship and love, then nodded softly, not because she believed everything would be easy, but because she believed in the daughter sitting in front of her. Mother and daughter sat together in that warm silence a while longer, with no need to say anything more, only the mother's hand resting inside her daughter's hands, while the morning sunlight slipped through the window and spread a gentle golden streak across the white blanket. But when Della left the hospital and stepped outside into the harsh glare of the street, the smile she had struggled to hold all morning faded away, and she knew that love, no matter how great, couldn't pay that cost by itself, that she was standing before a wall that a good heart alone couldn't climb. That evening, after she had soothed Maisie to sleep and sat alone in the dark kitchen, Della felt the full weight of the past few days gather and press down on her shoulders all at once, and for the first time since the night she had been fired, she allowed herself to cry, silently and without a sound, her shoulders trembling in the shadows of the small room. She had lost her job, had been smeared so badly that no place would take her, had been threatened even in her right to be a mother, and now her mother needed an amount of money she had no way to earn. In one weak moment, she wondered whether the easiest thing would be to give up everything, to lower her head, to disappear quietly exactly as those people wanted, so at least her child could be left in peace, and that threatening shadow would stop following them. But when she wiped her tears and lifted her head, her eyes fell directly on the refrigerator door, where Maisie's drawing was still taped beneath the dim light. The picture of the woman wearing a crown and carrying a tray, with the crooked little words calling her a hero, and something inside Della's chest suddenly hardened. She asked herself one very simple question, that if she collapsed now, if she allowed their lie to become the truth only because she wasn't strong enough to fight it, then how would she look into her daughter's eyes later? What would she teach the child about standing upright before what was wrong, when she herself had chosen to bow down the very first time she was tested? And the longer she sat in that darkness, the more she realized one essential thing that fear had blurred over the past several days, that everything they were using to destroy her was only words, a rumor without proof, an accusation that wasn't real, a threat hidden behind an unnamed number, and that a lie, no matter how many mouths repeated it and no matter how loudly it was told, could never turn itself into the truth. It only had power as long as no one placed something real on the scale against it. And that real twirling was in her hands. It was right there in the tin box on top of the cabinet, a stack of paper bills she had quietly gathered for months, silent but solid evidence that no poisonous whisper could erase. They could invent a story about her, but they couldn't reinvent the numbers that had been printed in black ink on white paper. And that was exactly where her strength lay. Not in money or power, but in the truth that she had accidentally become the only person to keep. Della stood up, took the tin box down, opened it, and looked at that stack of papers once more. But this time not with the eyes of someone afraid, with the eyes of someone who had just found her only weapon again. She thought of the man named Cassius Wolfe who had come to find her, of the sentence he had spoken, that perhaps he and she were looking at the same thing from two different sides, and she understood that the time had come for her to make a choice. Either keep holding her fear and that stack of papers until both rotted away in silence, or bring it into the light and accept every risk that came with it. She sat down, drew in a deep breath, and inside her, a decision took shape, clear and no longer able to be shaken, that she wouldn't stay silent, that she wouldn't let those $7 bury her name without a word of resistance, and that if someone had to step forward and pull down the whole fabric of lies, then that person would be her. The next morning, Della arranged to meet Cassius so she could give him the entire stack of bills, and she chose an empty parking lot behind an old shopping center as the meeting place, somewhere she thought was discreet and safe. But she had no idea that from the moment the rumor about her had been released, her every move had been watched far more closely than she realized. She arrived early, standing beside her car with the tin box clutched tightly in her arms, and only a few minutes later, two unfamiliar men she had never seen before stepped out of a car parked not far away and came straight toward her with the slow, calculated stride of men who knew exactly what they were doing. The man in front, large in build, stopped a few steps from her and spoke in a tone of false politeness that was even more frightening than a shout. He said a mutual friend had asked him to deliver her a message, that the mess of papers she was holding so tightly in her hands would be better forgotten, better burned, and that a wise woman with a young child at home should know when to stop before things went too far. Della stepped back, her spine touching the side of her car, her heart pounding hard, but she tried to keep her voice from shaking, as she answered that she had nothing to say to people who didn't dare give their names, and she hugged the box more tightly against her chest, as though she were holding the last thing she had left. The man gave a mocking laugh, then held out his hand and demanded that she give him the box, and when she shook her head, he took another step forward, the safe distance between her and them vanishing, and in that instant fear rose up and filled her throat. But just as his hand was about to touch the box, a deep, cold voice sounded from behind them, a voice that wasn't loud at all, yet had enough force to make both men freeze at once. as if an invisible hand had pressed them down. Cassius Wolf stepped out from between 2 rows of cars, unhurried, without a single wasted movement. And behind him, 2 of his men quietly spread out to either side, and the manner of his appearance alone was enough to reverse the entire balance of power in the parking lot. He asked them whether they knew whose ground they were standing on, and when the large man turned and saw his face clearly, the blood seemed to drain from him, because he had just recognized a name that even men like him had been warned never to touch. Cassius didn't need to say much. He only walked closer at a slow pace. His eyes locked on that man, and in that terrifyingly even voice, he said that from this moment on, this woman was under his protection, that whoever had sent them here today should listen carefully. Touching her or her daughter meant touching him, and that he advised them to go back and repeat those words very carefully to the person who had paid them. The 2 men didn't dare answer with even half a word. The aggression they had shown earlier vanished without a trace, and they backed slowly toward their car beneath the unblinking stare of Cassius's men, then hurried away, leaving the parking lot abruptly quiet again. Della stood there, her back still braced against the side of the car, both arms still wrapped around the box, and it took her a moment to realize she was trembling, not exactly from fear, but from the strange, unfamiliar feeling that for the first time in so many days, someone had stepped between her and the world that wanted to crush her. Cassius turned to her, and all the coldness from a moment earlier disappeared from his voice. He asked if she was all right with a calm concern that felt sincere. Della looked at him, and instead of thanking him right away, she asked why he was doing all this for a stranger like her. Cassius was silent for a moment, then answered that there were things in his past that made it impossible for him to stand by and turn away when someone was being driven into a corner by people stronger than they were, and that if she was willing to trust him a little more, he promised he would help her turn this whole matter back over, not through fear, but through the truth she was holding in her hands. Cassius took Della to a small, quiet coffee shop a few streets away so she could steady herself, and they sat across from each other at a wooden table in the corner, the tin box placed between them like a silent witness to the alliance slowly taking shape. Della was still shaken, and she asked him again what she had asked in the parking lot, why someone in his position would care about protecting a fired waitress he didn't even know, and this time Cassius didn't avoid the question. He didn't tell a long story. He only said softly that a very long time ago, he had watched a woman he loved be falsely accused and trampled by this very world of power until she had nothing left, and that ever since then, he had promised himself he would never stand still and watch that scene repeat itself again if he had the power to stop it. He said only that much, then stopped, but there was an old pain in his eyes deep enough for Della to understand that behind those few brief words was an entire story he didn't need to tell for her to feel it. And for the first time, she looked at the powerful man before her, not as some distant force to be wary of, but as a human being who had carried wounds of his own. The guardedness inside her softened a little, and she quietly said she was sorry for what he had been through, a simple but sincere sentence, and Cassius gave a faint nod, accepting it without adding anything more, because both of them understood that some things only needed to be acknowledged, not comforted. Then he turned to the matter before them with his usual sharpness. He told her that the $7 fee line on her bills matched exactly the suspicious stream of money he had been chasing for months inside the very assets that belonged to him, that she and he were facing the same enemy, except she was seeing it from the side of someone it had crushed, while he was seeing it from the side of someone being robbed inside his own house. He told her plainly that alone, with that stack of papers, she would never beat them, because they had money, connections, and even the ability to choke a person with whispers, as she had already tasted for herself. But if she agreed to work with him, if they combined the bills she was holding with what he could dig up from the inside, then the balance would change completely. Della waited in silence, and she said she wasn't used to trusting other people, especially not now, when trust had already cost her so many times. But she also admitted that she had reached the end of the road, and had no better choice than to place a wager on the man who had stepped between her and them when no one else had. Cassius told her he didn't demand that she trust him completely right away. He only asked her to believe one single thing, that he hated people who preyed on the vulnerable even more than she hated them, and because of that, their goal was now the same. There was something in the way he spoke, direct without ever being condescending, treating her as an equal rather than as some pitiful person in need of charity, that finally allowed trust to begin taking root inside Della. And she reached across the table, placing the tin box in his hands, a simple gesture that carried the full meaning of surrendering her faith to him. When their fingers brushed for a brief moment over the lid of the box, both of them felt something very slight. Not the hurried fever of reckless passion, but the quiet recognition between two people life had wounded, who now saw in each other a toughness worthy of respect. And Della pulled her hand back first, a little flustered, but for the first time in many long days, something stirred inside her that she had almost forgotten, the feeling that she no longer had to fight alone. Cassius didn't waste a single day, and by the very next morning, he had brought into the matter someone he trusted absolutely when cold precision was required. Margaret Doyle, an independent audit specialist, with many years of experience taking apart numbers that people had deliberately tried to bury. A calm woman with the habit of following the figures, rather than anyone's version of the story. They met in a discreet office, and after a brief hesitation, Cassius placed the tin box onto the table, prompting Della to gently pass the full stack of paper bills she had protected for so long to this woman. Margaret carefully put on gloves and began laying each sheet across the table in chronological order. Margaret worked in almost absolute silence, her eyes moving over every line of text, every number, and now and then she paused to write something in her own notebook, while Della and Cassius sat across from her, not daring to speak for fear of interrupting the flow of her thoughts. It was nearly an hour later before Margaret finally lifted her head, and she said those bills were valuable evidence on their own, but to turn them into something no one could deny, she needed to compare them against the electronic transaction data stored in the restaurant's payment system, what people in the business usually called the point-of-sale system, because every printed paper bill had to have a corresponding electronic record stored on the server. With Cassius's ability and access inside the very assets that belonged to him, pulling an export of that system's data wasn't difficult, and within only a few hours, Margaret had what she needed to begin the comparison. But it was right there, when she placed the electronic numbers beside Della's paper bills, that an irregularity immediately appeared and made the whole room grow heavy. Margaret pointed at the screen and said there was a major problem, that many of the electronic records corresponding to the $7 fee line on Della's paper bills had been deleted or altered in the system, as though someone, at some recent point, had quietly slipped in and swept away their traces, so that if inspectors reviewed the electronic books, they wouldn't find that suspicious charge anywhere. Cassius frowned, and he understood at once that the person behind this had moved one step ahead, had anticipated the risk, and destroyed the electronic evidence before anyone had time to dig toward it. A move that showed this wasn't the clumsy trick of a restaurant-level manager, but the hand of someone with enough access and enough cunning at a much higher level. For a moment, Della's face went pale, because she thought that if the data in the machine had already been erased, then all her effort had gone down the drain, that once again they had defeated her by wiping away the truth. But Margaret gave a faint smile, the rare smile of someone who had just seen her opponent make a fatal mistake, and she explained that the very fact that the other person had hurried to delete the electronic data was what saved them. Because first, a large system like this always created periodic backups, stored on a backup server that a hurried deletion couldn't reach, and comparing the old backup with the current data would immediately expose the very act of erasing traces. And second, more important than anything, were the very paper bills Della had quietly preserved all these months. She lifted one sheet beneath the light and said that the other person might be able to erase numbers from a computer, but they couldn't reach into Della's kitchen and erase these papers. And now, every paper bill with a fee line whose corresponding electronic record had been deleted had become double evidence, proving both that the suspicious charge had once existed and that someone had deliberately tried to destroy it. Della looked at her small stack of papers with an entirely different gaze, and she realized that the quiet habit that had once seemed meaningless in the life of a poor waitress had now become the link that an entire hidden conspiracy could no longer untangle. For the next 2 days, Margaret Doyle almost never left the workroom, following each thread of the money trail with the patience of a skilled craftswoman untangling a knotted skein. And when she finally gathered enough pieces to sit down and lay out the whole picture for Cassius and Della, what emerged left both of them silent. Margaret explained that the $7 optional service fee Della had discovered wasn't a single mistake at the Ardent Room alone, but a carefully designed mechanism planted inside the payment system of an entire chain of restaurants, quietly adding that small charge to the bills of carefully selected guests, people who were least likely to notice or speak up. She said that the amount itself, $7, sounded so small it was almost laughable, so small that no one who lost it would bother filing a complaint. And that was the very cunning of the whole scheme, because that seemingly insignificant charge, when multiplied by thousands of bills every month, then multiplied again over many long months across an entire restaurant chain, had quietly gathered into a massive stream of money, flowing steadily without setting off a single alarm inside the system. Della sat listening and felt a chill move through her, because she had thought she understood how serious the thing in her hands was. But she had never imagined that the tiny line printed at the bottom of the bills she carried to customers was part of a money-draining machine that large, and that all this time, she herself had unknowingly been a small cog inside that machine. But what truly brought the picture into focus was when Margaret traced where that money stream finally went, because after passing through several layers of disguise built to misdirect anyone looking too closely, every dollar collected from that surcharge mechanism led back to one single point. And that point was Lionel Frost, the regional operations director sitting in the upper office, the man who had designed the whole system and run it from a position high enough that no one in the restaurants below could see his hand. Margaret explained further that Lionel's poisonous cleverness lay in the fact that he hadn't turned the stolen money into a secret stream of cash. On the contrary, he let it flow straight into the books, under the respectable name of service revenue, making the business numbers of the restaurants under him look unusually strong. And this was exactly where Gerald Boyd fit into the whole story, because that false service revenue had helped his restaurant stay at the top of the performance rankings again and again, bringing him praise, bonuses, and a position he understood very well had been built on the foundation of a lie. That was why he had turned a blind eye, and had been willing to throw an innocent woman out as a sacrifice to protect that rotten foundation from being examined by the inspectors. Cassius listened to everything with a face that grew darker by the moment, because now he fully understood the enemy he was facing. A man who had been sitting inside his own operation, using his own assets as tools to pick the pockets of thousands of people. And Margaret ended with a sentence that all three people in the room felt deeply. That this entire sophisticated machine, worth a great deal of money and built so carefully so no one would ever see it, had finally been sparked and exposed by one poor waitress who had cared enough to pay attention to a number all those clever men had believed was too small for anyone to bother noticing. Cassius chose a solemn conference room on the upper floor of a building he owned as the place for the confrontation, and he summoned exactly the people who needed to be present: Lionel Frost, Gerald Boyd, Margaret Doyle with her complete file, and Della Hartman, the woman who, even as she stepped into that room, still had no idea that this morning would decide the course of her entire life all over again. When Lionel walked in and saw Della sitting there, a flicker of confusion crossed his face before he managed to hide it behind his professional calm, because he had not expected the woman he had ordered silenced to be sitting openly in a room like this, under the protection of a man even he had to fear. Gerald turned pale from the very second he crossed the doorway, his hands clenched tightly together, his eyes darting again and again between Lionel and Cassius like an animal realizing it had just stepped into a trap. Cassius sat at the head of the table, unhurried, and he allowed the silence in the room to stretch for several heavy seconds before he spoke. When he did, his voice wasn't loud, and there was no showy anger in it, only a steady coldness like steel, the kind of voice that frightened people more than any shouting ever could. He said he had invited everyone here not to argue about who was right and who was wrong, because that had already been answered clearly on the pages laid out before them, but only so that each person could see with their own eyes what they had believed they had successfully buried, now being brought into the light. Lionel tried to salvage the situation, speaking in the smooth voice of a man used to controlling meetings, saying this must surely be an unfortunate misunderstanding, that any irregularities in the books, if they existed at all, were operational errors at the restaurant level, and had nothing to do with him, and he cast a quick glance toward Gerald, as though preparing silently to push the entire burden of blame down onto the manager. But Margaret calmly placed one file after another on the table, comparing Della's paper bills with the backup data, pointing out each trace of the deleted electronic records, then following the money trail all the way back to the single destination where it ended, and with every word she spoke, another escape door closed tighter around Lionel, until the confidence on his face began to crack. In the middle of it all, every eye in the room suddenly turned toward Della when Cassius looked at her and asked what she wanted, after everything that had been done to her, whether she wanted her position restored, her name cleared, or compensation for the days she had just endured. The whole room waited for her answer, and Lionel leaned forward slightly, as though he already had a familiar exit in mind, using money and a job reinstatement to buy her silence, exactly the way his world had always worked. But Della stood up, and in a calm yet unyielding voice, she said she had not come here to beg for her job back, and she had not come here to bargain for money in exchange for forgetting what had happened. She said that if her only goal had been to get her monthly paycheck back, she could have accepted it the very night they realized they had chosen the wrong person to blame, instead of enduring everything that had happened afterward. The only thing she wanted, she said, was a thorough investigation, for the truth to be brought fully into the light, not only for herself, but for the thousands of people who had been robbed $7 at a time without ever knowing it, people who had no one to speak on their behalf. Her words left the room still, and they stripped Lionel of the last weapon he had thought he still held, because a person who asked for nothing for herself couldn't be bought. Cassius looked at Della with unconcealed respect, then turned back to Lionel, and in a few final, cold sentences, he said Lionel had been mistaken when he believed that pushing a person low enough would make that person too afraid to lift her head, and that this arrogant mistake would now be the very thing that brought down everything he had built. Lionel opened his mouth as if to answer, but no words came out, because looking into the eyes of the man seated at the head of the table, for the first time in many years, he understood that he had truly lost. Driven into a corner, and feeling clearly that the ground beneath his feet was beginning to collapse, Lionel Frost immediately did exactly what men like him always did when the ship began to sink. He looked at once for someone else to shove into the water in his place. He suddenly changed both his attitude and his tone. From a man denying all involvement, he shifted into the role of a superior who had just been stunned to discover wrongdoing by someone beneath him, and he turned to point straight at Gerald Boyd, saying that if some fraudulent mechanism truly existed, then the only person with access to it and the ability to operate it every day was the manager of this restaurant, that he himself, sitting in a distant regional office, could hardly be expected to control every fee line on every single bill. To strengthen that accusation, Lionel pulled out a file he had prepared in advance, a stack of printed emails, and placed them on the table with the triumphant air of a man who believed he still held the final card. He said these were proof that Gerald himself was the one who had actively built the entire system and run it on his own, to chase performance numbers without ever reporting it to his superiors. Those emails had been forged with great sophistication, staged so that every lead pointed back to Gerald alone, and for a brief moment the whole room seemed to pause, because if no one could take them apart, then Lionel might very well slip out of the net once again and leave Gerald to bear every ounce of guilt. But Lionel had made one fatal mistake he hadn't foreseen. He had grown too used to seeing Gerald as a disposable pawn that could be thrown away at any moment, and had forgotten that even a pawn driven all the way to the edge knew how to defend itself. Gerald, who had been sitting shrunken in fear since the beginning of the meeting, suddenly snapped his head up when he heard Lionel's accusation, and on his pale face, fear in that instant was replaced by something else, the raw outrage of a man who had just realized he had been openly betrayed by the very person he had served for so long. He stood up, trembling but determined, and said that he had known this day would come, had known Lionel would never hesitate to push him out as a sacrifice, and that because he had seen it coming, he had prepared something to protect himself. Then, under Lionel's stunned gaze, Gerald took out his phone and placed on the table everything he had quietly saved for many months. Not a few vague emails that could be forged, but an entire trove of messages and recorded calls in which Lionel's own voice gave orders, instructed him step by step on how to install the fee, how to choose which customers to target, how to blur the numbers in the books, and how to hide them before every inspection. Margaret took them and looked through them, then gave Cassius a slight nod, confirming that the evidence was real, that the timestamps and origins matched completely and couldn't be fabricated, and that they exposed beyond denial that the mastermind at the top of the entire scheme was no one other than Lionel Frost himself. The reversal happened so quickly that Lionel could barely react, his face turning ashen as he stared at the forged emails that had been his weapon only moments earlier, and were now meaningless before the living proof unleashed by his own sacrificial pawn. And for the first time, the cunning calm he had worked so hard to maintain collapsed completely. Della sat silently and watched the whole scene unfold, and she recognized a truth that was bitter yet deeply just, that this empire of lies had not finally been brought down from the outside, but had rotted and broken apart from within, because once something had been built on betrayal, it would also be ended by the very betrayal it had nourished. What happened after the confrontation was not as loud as people often imagine the downfall of powerful men to be. It unfolded quietly, coldly, and methodically, exactly the way Cassius Wolfe handled everything. And it was that very silence that made it most terrifying. He didn't need a threat or a single act of violence. He only needed to pick up the phone and make a few calls to the right people in the right positions. And the machine of power in his hands began moving around Lionel Frost and Gerald Boyd, like a net being drawn tight from every side at once. The entire file Margaret had compiled, from Della's paper bills, to the backup data showing traces of deletion and alteration, to the trove of messages and recordings Gerald had produced, was handed over fully and lawfully to the proper authorities, and an official investigation was opened. One that no force could cover up or divert this time. Lionel Frost, the man who had once sat in a high position and controlled an entire network from the shadows, now watched everything he had worked so hard to build break apart, piece by piece. The accounts connected to the fraudulent money stream were frozen for the investigation, and the powerful relationships he had once taken such pride in turned their backs on him one after another, vanishing the moment his name became tied to a scandal, because in the world he belonged to, no one wanted to be linked to a man who was already sinking. The man who had once believed he was clever enough to take $7 at a time from thousands of people and never be discovered, finally lost everything. His career, his reputation, his wealth, and the respectable mask he had hidden behind for so long, and he had to face the legal consequences of what he himself had done. Gerald Boyd did not escape the price of his complicity and cowardice either. He lost his management position, along with all the false achievements that had once been painted around him. And from then on, his name would be tied to this matter like a stain that couldn't be washed away, though his cooperation and his decision to turn over evidence at the final moment helped him receive some measure of leniency compared with the mastermind. Amid all those collapses, one person came to Della with an entirely different spirit, and that was Owen Brady, the young server who had signed the false statement under pressure. He came to see her, and the moment he stood before her, he couldn't hold himself together anymore. He confessed everything, telling her about the morning he had been forced to sign, about his fear of losing his job, about his sick mother and the debts that had made him weak, and he said he hadn't had a single peaceful night of sleep since the day he put his pen to that paper. He said he knew an apology was far too small compared with everything she had been forced to bear. But he still had to say it aloud because he couldn't go on living with that silence any longer. Della looked at the young man standing there with his head bowed in remorse, and instead of the anger she perhaps had every right to feel, understanding rose inside her, because more than anyone, she knew what it felt like to be driven into a place where a person had to choose between conscience and the bread on the table, knew the bare fear of a young person with nothing in his hands. She placed a hand on his shoulder and told him she didn't blame him, that she understood he was also another victim of the same people who had hurt her, and that what mattered was that, in the end, he had chosen to tell the truth when he could have continued staying silent. She told him that real courage was not having never fallen, but daring to stand back up and make right what he had done wrong, and that forgiveness from her lifted from the young man's shoulders the burden he had thought he would have to carry for the rest of his life. A few weeks later, when Della came to the hospital with a heavy worry pressing on her heart, bracing herself to ask for more time on the hospital bill she still had no idea how to manage, the nurse at the reception desk looked at her with mild surprise and told her that the entire cost of her mother's treatment had been paid in full. Della froze where she stood, thinking she must have misheard, and she asked again to be certain, but the nurse only smiled and confirmed that not only had the intensive treatment been covered, the costs for her mother's coming recovery period had also been taken care of by an anonymous benefactor who didn't wish to leave a name. In that moment, standing in the bright white hallway of the hospital, Della didn't need anyone to tell her who that silent benefactor was, because there was only one person in the world who both knew about her mother's situation and had the ability to arrange everything so quietly that no trace was left behind, and who was thoughtful enough never to turn his kindness into a debt placed on her shoulders. She thought of Cassius, of the way he had not once mentioned this during all the days they had stood side by side to bring the truth back into the light, and she understood that he had quietly done it at some point without her knowing, not so she would feel obligated to him, but simply because he could, and because that was the kind of man he was. Her eyes grew hot, and this time the tears that rolled down her cheeks were no longer tears of shame or despair like those earlier nights, but the tears of a woman who had just realized that after all the cruelty life had thrown at her, unconditional kindness still existed somewhere in this world. She quickly wiped her face and walked toward her mother's hospital room, and when she pushed the door open, a scene was waiting for her that filled her chest with a warmth she hadn't felt in a very long time. Her mother was able to sit up now, leaning back against the head of the bed, her color noticeably healthier than it had been during Della's last visit. And sitting beside her in the chair was Maisie, who had been brought to visit her grandmother by the kind neighbor. The little girl was eagerly showing her a new drawing and giggling over some joke her grandmother had made. The sight of grandmother and granddaughter gathered together in the morning light, the clear laughter of the child mingling with the voice of the older woman that had regained a little of its strength, was everything Della had fought to protect through the dark days just past. And she stood silently at the threshold looking at it for a long while, not wanting to move for fear the precious moment might vanish. When Maisie was taken out into the hallway by the neighbor, so mother and daughter could have a little time alone, Della came to sit beside the bed and took her mother's hand, a hand that was warmer now, and able to squeeze her daughter's much more firmly than before. Her mother looked at her daughter for a long time with knowing eyes, and though no one had told her the whole story, with a mother's instinct, she knew her child had just passed through an unbearably difficult road. She gently squeezed Della's hand and said in a voice that was clearer now that she was proud of her, not because she had defeated anyone or gained anything, but because in her most desperate days, she still hadn't traded away her integrity for an easier path. She said people could take a person's job, money, even their good name in the eyes of the world for a time. But there was one thing no one had the right to take unless we willingly handed it over, and that was our dignity, the way we kept ourselves upright when no one forced us to do so. Della bent her head and pressed her mother's hand against her cheek, and in that hospital room filled with morning sunlight, for the first time in many days, she felt the weight she had been carrying finally fall away, and felt that everything she had struggled to endure had been worth it. The official investigation finally concluded with a clear and public finding, that Della Hartman was completely innocent, that she had never touched a single dollar, and that her dismissal from the Ardent Room had been nothing more than an attempt to shift blame onto her in order to hide a far greater wrongdoing. The name that had once been smeared by groundless whispers was now fully restored before everyone who had ever heard the false story about her. But what made Della proud was not only that her own honor had been returned to her, but that the thousands of people who had been quietly drained of $7 at a time without ever knowing it were now given back what had been taken from them. The elderly guests, the solitary diners, the ordinary people no one had bothered to speak for all this time. With the compensation she received after everything, Della did not use it to buy herself an easier life, as many people might have imagined. Instead, she chose to establish a small fund dedicated to helping and protecting poor workers who had been treated unfairly. Housekeepers, servers, and people who did quiet, overlooked work, and were so often treated as though they had no voice, so they would have a place to turn and someone to stand on their side whenever they were pressed down by those with power, exactly as she herself had once longed for during the loneliest days of her life. On the wall of the small office where the fund was based, Della had the first bill she had ever noticed with that $7 fee line placed inside a simple glass frame, the one from a distant summer evening, and beneath it she had a line written to remind everyone who walked in that no injustice is ever too small to deserve being spoken of, and no human being is ever too insignificant to deserve the protection of their dignity. Cassius remained in her life, not with flowery promises or grand gestures, but through a quiet and steady presence. He became her companion, the silent supporter of her work, and between two people who had each carried wounds of their own, a deep feeling began to grow, built on respect and understanding, a kind of love that did not need to be named in haste but simply kept growing naturally with the years, warm and solid. And every afternoon, when Della watched Maisie running and playing in the yard beside her grandmother, who had recovered and now sat smiling gently beneath the sunlight, she understood that everything she had endured had finally blossomed into something more beautiful than she had ever dared to dream. Della's story leaves each of us with something simple yet profound, that a person's worth is never measured by the position or possessions they have, but by the way they keep themselves upright in their hardest moments, and that sometimes, when just one person dares to care about something everyone else considers too small to matter, an enormous injustice can be dragged into the light, because goodness and kindness, no matter how quiet they may be, always carry a power that evil can never fully foresee. If this story has touched your heart, please click like and share it to spread this beautiful message to even more people, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can listen to more moving and meaningful stories every day. How do you feel about Della's story? Which character did you love most? And which part moved you the most? Please leave a comment sharing the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear your sincere thoughts. May everyone listening to this story always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next stories.